Hello, health lovers. So it's your cute student Nurse V, and we are still talking on the female reproductive system. So we have described the external genitalia, the internal genitalia, and we also described the accessory organ of reproduction, which is the breast. Now, moving forward, we are going to be talking about menstrual cycle. You have been hearing about menstrual cycle. What is menstrual cycle? What is this thing all about? Now, when you hear cycle, it means something turning from one turns till it gets back to the initial position it began. Now, what is menstrual cycle? Menstrual cycle is a series of events that takes place within 28 to 30 days in the reproductive age of a woman. So those series of events that takes place usually 20, because some people have 28-day cycle, some people have 30-day cycle. So those events that takes place during those days is called the menstrual cycle. Now, that takes us to the phases or stages of menstrual cycle. Now you may ask yourself, what are these events? I want to know these events. Now I'm going to teach you about the events that takes place in every woman's life. Now take note, it's not from childbirth. Every reproductive period of a woman, that's from puberty to menopause. So from puberty, your menstrual cycle begins, and after menopause, your menstrual cycle stops. Now, what are these events that takes place? We have the menstruation, which is the menstrual phase. We have the follicular phase. Then we have the ovulation, and we have the secretory phase. I'll take that again. Those series of events that takes place in menstrual cycle are the menstruation, which is the menstrual phase. Then we have the follicular phase. We have the ovulation, and we have the secretory phase. Now, let's talk about the menstrual phase. Now, the menstrual phase marks the beginning of a woman's menstrual cycle. So the first day you see your period, that is the beginning of your menstrual cycle. So if you don't know your menstrual cycle, you take a pen now. The first day you see your period till the next month, first day you will see your period there. Calculate those days. That is your menstrual cycle. It might be 28, it might be 30. If it's below 28 or it's more than 30, you're having irregular menstrual cycle. Now, back to the discussion of the day. Menstruation marks the beginning of a woman's menstrual cycle. Now, how does this menstruation occurs? Now, menstruation occurs when the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone drops rapidly. Now, when this thing drops, it causes tissue death. And those tissue deaths is the shredding of the endothelial lining of the uterus, and it will lead to bleeding. I'll take it again. Menstruation marks the beginning of a woman's menstrual cycle. First, that's the first day to like 4 days, and it happens when the follicle stimulating hormone, which is secreted by the adrenal hypophysis, and the luteinizing hormone that is also secreted by the adrenal hypophysis. Now they drop rapidly, and this drop leads to tissue death. Now, how did they drop? They drop rapidly, it leads to tissue death, and it causes bleeding, which is menstruation. Now, that takes us to the second phase of the menstrual cycle, which is the follicular phase. Now, from the word follicle, you should have an idea what it's all about. Now, follicular phase is the second phase of menstrual cycle, and it begins from, that's immediately after menstruation. Now, what happens is that the uterine lining, which is the endothelial layer of the uterus that's shredded during menstruation, will begin to build up in this phase. And now this is as a result of the secretion of the follicle stimulating hormone from the adrenal hypophysis. So the follicle stimulating hormone will cause the uterine lining to build up and also cause the ovarian follicle to grow in size and become matured. Now this phase ends immediately ovulation starts. Now the next phase of menstrual cycle is the ovulation. It begins from day 14. Now what happens is that now in the previous phase, remember that follicle stimulating hormone played a role by increasing the size of the ovarian follicle, making it matured. Now in this ovulation phase, luteinizing hormone is going to be secreted rapidly from the adrenal hypophysis, and it's going to go and act on the ovarian follicle that is already matured and cause it to burst. Now once this ovarian follicle bursts, it releases an egg, and this egg is called ovum. It releases ovum that travels through the fallopian tube and gets to the ampulla of the fallopian tube, where it can be fertilized. Now fertilization takes place in the ampulla of the fallopian tube. So during this ovulation, if sperm come in contact with this egg that has been released from the Graafian follicle, then pregnancy takes place. Now that takes us to the last phase, which is the secretory phase. Now in this secretory phase, this is the last phase of menstrual cycle, and what happens in this phase is that the ovaries is going to secrete two key hormones, which is the progesterone and the estrogen. Now, the progesterone and estrogen is now going to act on the uterus lining and prepare it for implantation. Now, if there is no fertilization, we are going back to the first one. Remember, it's a cycle. Now, if there is no fertilization, the progesterone and the estrogen level will drop rapidly. And when it drops rapidly, it causes degeneration in the corpus luteum. And once the corpus luteum is degenerated, it leads to what? Tissue death. And this tissue then has to do with the shredding of the endothelial layer. And once the endothelial layer shreds, that takes us to the first step, that's the first stage of menstrual cycle, which is menstruation. Now, menstruation occurs because there is no fertilization. So that is all for the menstrual cycle. If I want to recap, the first one is the menstruation phase. The second phase is the follicular phase, the phase of build-up. The third phase is the ovulation phase. That is the phase when an egg is being released. Then the last phase is the secretory phase, where the hormones are being secreted from the ovaries. So that is all for the menstrual cycle. Now, moving forward, we are going to be talking about oogenesis. Now, what is oogenesis? Now, you know that anything that has to do with genesis in anatomy has to do with build-up. So oogenesis is the formation of female gametes, which is the ova, in an ovary. So the formation or the production of female gametes in the ovary is called oogenesis. Now, how is this gamete, how is this ovum formed? Now, we have three stages of oogenesis. We have before birth, we have during that's during puberty to menopause, then the last stage is after fertilization. I'll take it again. We have three stages of oogenesis. We have before birth, from puberty to menopause, and we have after fertilization. When you are a fetus still in the womb, your ovaries is already formed. Now, how is it formed before birth? Now, the primordial germ cells, anything that has to do with germ cells, they are germinating cells that can germinate to any other type of cells. So the primordial germ cells is going to migrate to form what we call the oogonia. Now, that is the first thing that is going to be formed. Now, this oogonia that is formed is now going to undergo rapid mitotic division. Now, we say mitotic division because it has to do with increase. Anything that has to do with growth is mitosis. So it undergoes rapid mitotic divisions, and some of them is going to enlarge to what we call the primary oocyte. The primary oocyte. Now, this primary oocyte undergoes meiosis 1, but stops at prophase 1 until puberty. So if you're not up to the age of puberty, you're having a primary oocyte because you have that hormones is not released to make it complete its meiosis 1. Now, the second stage of oogenesis is from puberty to menopause. That's from puberty. Now, what happens is that this primary oocyte is going to complete the meiosis 1, and two things are being produced. The secondary oocyte is produced, and a small polar body. Now, a small polar body, that one is just like useless. So we are going to focus on the secondary oocyte. Now, the secondary oocyte undergoes meiosis 2, because after meiosis 1, there's meiosis 2. So it undergoes meiosis 2 and stops at metaphase onto fertilization. Now, take note that the Graafian follicles release a secondary oocyte during ovulation. So if you're not pregnant, your eggs are not fertilized, that means the egg you have in you is a secondary oocyte. That means it has not completed the meiosis 2. Now, the last stage of oogenesis is after fertilization. Now, what happens after fertilization is that when the sperm come in contact with the ovum, it produces two things. It produces the nucleus. The nucleus of the ovum is there, and we have another polar body. Now, that polar body is already put aside. Now, the nucleus of the sperm fuses with the nucleus of the ovum, and once this takes place, meiosis 2 is completed at that point. And once meiosis 2 is completed, a zygote is formed. So those are the stages of oogenesis: before birth, from puberty to menopause, then we have after fertilization. The next thing I'm going to be talking about is fertilization. So what is fertilization? Now, fertilization is a process in which the nucleus of an haploid sperm fuses with the nucleus of an haploid egg, that's ova, to form a zygote. And that zygote is diploid because it has two sets of chromosomes. Now, what are the process or stages or phases of fertilization? Now, the first one we have is sperm transport. Sperm transport. The next thing we have is penetration of the ovum. Now, the next thing we also have is cortical reaction. Then we also have completion of meiosis 2 and fusion of gametes. Fusion of gametes. So the first stage or the first phase has to do with sperm transport. So this takes place during coitus. Coitus is a medical term for sexual intercourse. So during coitus, millions of sperms are introduced into the female reproductive system through the vagina. So what happens is that this sperm swims swims as fast as they could, and many of the sperm would die in the vagina because of the acidity of the vagina. Now this sperm swims to the neck of the uterus, which is the cervix, and try to find their way in, because the cervix is kind of narrow. So in the process of finding their way into the uterus, most of them die on the way. Most of them are being trapped in the fold of the cervix. Now only few hundreds of thousands or hundreds of sperm get to the uterus. Now in the uterus, some sperm migrate to the other side of the fallopian tube, and another sperm migrate to another side of the fallopian tube. Now it's only one part of the fallopian tube that has the matured egg, that's the ovum, that has the ovum. Now the one going to the part of the fallopian tube that doesn't have ovum will end up dying in the process. Now we are not talking about the ones that get to the fallopian tube where the ovum is. Now at that point, the sperm undergo what we call capacitation. Now what is capacitation? This is the ability of a sperm to fertilize an egg. So now let's talk about the second step, which is penetration of the ovum. Now on reaching the ovum, the sperm has a part in his head which is called the acrosomes. Now this acrosomes is going to secrete an enzyme called the beta gluconesidase. Now this enzymes helps the sperm to digest the corona radiata and the zona pellucida of the ovum. Now the corona radiata has some kind of fold, so this sperm finds its way through the corona radiata and getting to the second layer or the second membrane of that's the second layer of the ovum, that is the zona pellucida. Now in that layer there are sperm receptors which gives way for the sperm to easily digest that layer and get into the egg. And once that is done, that takes us to the third fertilization, which is cortical reaction. Now once one successful sperm penetrates the egg, the ovum changes its membrane such in a way that other sperm cannot penetrate. Even if they try to, it will trap them and push those sperm out, trap them there. Now why is this so? Is to prevent what we call polyspermy. Polyspermy is when an egg is being fertilized by more than one sperm. Now after this is done, that takes us to the next stage, and the next stage is completion of meiosis 2. Now once the sperm, that first successful sperm, gets into the egg, meiosis 2 is completed, forming one nucleus and a second polar body. Now this nucleus of the egg fuses with the nucleus of the sperm, and once this fuses, that takes us to the last stage of fertilization, which is fusion of nuclei. So the mixture of a sperm and the ovum is called a zygote, and once the zygote is formed, the zygote then travels through the fallopian tube, undergo cleavage, that is multiple cell division, becomes a morula of 16 cells, becomes a blastocyte, and further implant itself to the uterine lining. So that is all for fertilization. So thank you very much for watching. Do well to share, like, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and do well to put your notification on for more health videos. Thank you.